I'm Beck and welcome to my spoiler-free review of Tress of the Emerald Sea, the first book in Brandon Sanderson's wildly successful Kickstarter. This book is loosely inspired as well by The Princess Bride, where Princess Buttercup waits for her love to return to her. Tress does the opposite and realizes that the prince that she loves has been sent away, and so she goes on a sea voyage quest to go and save him. Now, you may be able to notice behind me on the bookshelf up here that I'm a massive fan of Brandon Sanderson, so when it came to his Kickstarter, I was really hopeful and really excited, but I was trying to also temper those hopes and excitements because sometimes the tone of his work doesn't always match what my enjoyment level is expecting, and I don't love all of his books. While I do have significant favorites, I don't love everything he writes, so I was trying to kind of wear that hat when I went into this book, and I'm kind of glad I did, because while there were some things I loved about this, there were other things that didn't quite hit the mark for me, and so I'm going to talk about all of them. There are loosely two narrators in this book. One obviously is Tress because she's the main character, and then the other one is Hoyd, who is called a world hopper, and he is loosely cameoed throughout different Brandon Sanderson books because in the Cosmere universe he's quite a significant character, but we haven't really got his story yet. We've only got bits and pieces of him, so we don't really understand who he is in a grand scale yet, and this is a story that was starting to kind of lay those foundations for us, but sometimes with Hoyd's narration style I didn't quite vibe with it. But first of all, I'm going to talk about Tress because she is the main character. She's basically like if you and me went on a fantasy journey. She's living on this island, this massive rock, in amongst the Emerald Sea, which is not an ocean per se. It is a sea that's made up of spores, so it's not a wet ocean, and if water comes in contact with these spores, it causes massive explosive like vines. Some spores cause specific explosions when contacting with moisture, so it's not a particularly typical ocean, but she is just very content living on this island, collecting her cups and going about her mundane life with Charlie, the prince that she's fallen in love with. But her inciting action happens a few months after Charlie disappears because the king makes Charlie, the prince, go and find a princess so he can marry off his oldest and only son. However, when his son comes back, it's not the Charlie that was initially sent away, it's a different guy with a princess that the king has now taken on to be the next heir. And so Tress is like, where is Charlie? And that is the inciting action a few months after this not Charlie person arrives back on the island. Tress thinks about it a lot, talks with her parents, which is nice because as a main character she's not an orphan, and then decides to go on this sea voyage to find him when she has no nautical experience whatsoever. But then Hoyd is one of the narrators here, and we go from Tress to Hoyd because Hoyd is on the pirate ship where Tress is going on her journey, and so because we see that crossover of Tress and Hoyd, we obviously hear from Hoyd as a character. But while as readers we know that he's linked to a lot of lore, you don't really necessarily need to know that before going into this, but it is handy to have some of that understanding because there were a few throwaway references to different major series by Sanderson. I'm obviously not going to say what the references are and what books because I feel like those might be mild spoilers, but just know that there are references to other series, and so if you want to read this as a standalone to try and understand Sanderson's work and whether you'll like it or not, it's a good attempt at trying to figure that out. But I'd also recommend starting with The Final Empire instead, which is the first Mistborn book. Both of these will give you an idea of whether you like Sanderson or not. But circling back to Hoyd, I'm somebody who didn't love his portrayal in this book, and I know that a lot of people adored him, but for me his voice felt reiterative and he would tell stories that just felt like the paragraph could be cut in a third or even in half. It felt like he was elaborating way too much and using way too much metaphor for me. And when he told his jokes, they didn't quite land for me. I think it's just the style and tone of his character. It feels adjacent to what I would prefer to read about. And so sometimes I did crack a smile and other times I just skim read across his paragraphs because I wasn't interested. I also found that this happened a lot during the first 2/3 of the book. So for me, that is why the pace dragged, because the characters were just in one place on the ship. They didn't really do much. It was more about Tress learning things. And so because there wasn't actual literal movement in the book, it felt like it stagnated for me, and it took me several months to get through this, which I think the pace was a key contributor for that, for me personally. But on the flip side of the pace feeling like it dragged a lot, I think it didn't necessarily drag all the time. It lingered on things, and those things were valuable in terms of understanding the world building, which is a major part of this book that I really loved, because we got to see Tress's understanding building of the world and also the other characters' fears and how that worked into the way the world operated. And it was cool to see different ways the world building got subverted or even exploited. Those were the parts of the story and those interesting facets that I enjoyed. There was also an animal companion that I found quite enjoyable in this as well, kind of added that extra layer. But while there were obviously a lot of descriptions of the ship and of the world building, there are a lot of asides for the different characters on the ship as well, and I honestly really didn't care about them. So when it kind of went on different tangents and built different characters up, after a certain point I just didn't care anymore and I wanted the story to progress. So that kind of worked against it for me. And also something that I was super bummed about was that usually with Sanderson everything surprises me, but in this book I predicted one of the major twists, which is very disappointing to me just as a reader that consumes Sanderson work quite often. I was like, this doesn't usually happen, what's going on? Maybe because it was built in that fairy tale arc of a character goes on a quest or journey and then through their own personal growth there is a message that the book leaves you with. Maybe because it was kind of cyclical like a fairy tale, it was easier to predict. But I've seen a lot of people saying how much they adored this book and that it was amazing and the plot surprised them. So I don't know whether I'm in the majority or the minority for that one. So yeah, that little twist, it took away a little bit of the magic of the story for me, even though overall I did enjoy the mechanisms of the story. And with Sanderson, usually the ending of his works are quite jam-packed, and that was the same for this book. I found it really picked up in the last third, not necessarily because it was, you know, like Mistborn or Stormlight in that there was this massive action sequence with all this stuff moving everywhere and like choreographed fight scenes. Tress doesn't know how to fight with a sword, so it wasn't like it was a huge fight scene per se, but it built up enough momentum for the ending to have an interesting resolution and impact, and I really liked that about the particular characters that were involved. You can probably tell from the way I've talked about this book, obviously I've enjoyed parts of it, but I haven't enjoyed the whole thing, and so it's not my favorite of Sanderson's works unfortunately, but it was still a really solid fantasy quest pirate sea voyage story that I enjoyed, and I particularly liked the themes of it, which were introspection, appreciating the mundane, striving for the remarkable, and loving those around you. Those really shone in the book in my opinion, especially through Tress's unobtrusive personality and perspective. I found all of those themes were touched on and balanced really well across the entire story. Overall, it took me from February to May to finish this book, so because of that lingering pace, like I said, that sometimes worked for it but sometimes didn't, and also because of Hoyd's narration style and the writing style and tone that sometimes didn't quite match up with my personal enjoyment, I'm giving this book a 3.5 stars out of 5 because while I did enjoy a lot of it, there were parts that kind of let it down for me, even though I will be picking up the rest of his Kickstarter books, and I obviously picked this one up because I'm a Sanderson fan through and through and I love every bit of the Cosmere crumbs that I can get my hands on. But that is the end of my spoiler-free review. Let me know down below if you have read this or are considering reading this. I would be interested to know what you also rated it compared to one of your favorite Sanderson books. But thank you again so much for watching this video. I'll come chat with you down in the comments below and I'll see you in my next one. Bye.